Hello and welcome. I am Karina Lesser, Artistic Director of Scripps Presents, and I'm so glad to have so many of you joining us for this conversation with Elizabeth Turk, Betsy, Paluck, Levy, Marla, Spivak, and Scripps' own Nancy Macko, who will be moderating. This program kicks off the Scripps Presents fall season. Our series seeks to complement the dynamic humanities curriculum at the college by bringing the most thoughtful and timely writers, artists, and scholars into conversation with our community. This fall, we'll be hosting the likes of Wole Soyinka, Hillary Rodham Clinton, Sandra Cisneros, Rebecca Solnit, and Kathy Park Hong, among others. We hope you'll join us. Today's guests are scholars and artists whose work provides fascinating insights into how communities come together and influence one another. Princeton psychologist Betsy Levy Paluck's work is motivated by the idea that social psychological theory offers potentially useful tools for changing society in constructive ways, and that studying attempts to change society is one of the most fruitful ways to develop and assess social psychological theory. A MacArthur Fellow, much of Professor Paluck's work has focused on prejudice and intergroup conflict reduction. Marla Spivak is the Distinguished McKnight University Professor at the University of Minnesota's Entomology Department. She is also a MacArthur Fellow, and her lab focuses on honeybees, looking at issues ranging from basic studies on mechanisms of social immunity and behavior to applied studies on bee breeding and management. Elizabeth Turk is an artist known for marble sculpture. She is also a MacArthur Fellow, an Anna Lee and Barnett Newman Foundation recipient, and a Smithsonian Artist Fellow, among other awards. Turk received her MFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art and her BA from a special college called Scripps. We're so glad to have you back. Under the auspices of ET Projects, Elizabeth has visioned brilliant community arts events. We're lucky enough to be hosting the latest iteration called Look Up this Saturday morning on the Scripps campus. And we're so lucky today to have Professor of Art Nancy Macko, who also holds the Mary W. Johnson Professorship in Teaching and is the director of the Scripps Digital Art Program, moderating today. Nancy's work is in numerous public collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her work combines elements of printmaking, digital media, photography, video, and installation. Her multimedia exhibition, The Fragile Bee, is traveling nationally through 2023. A few housekeeping notes. As always, we love to hear from you, our audience. So please pop your questions in the chat at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to get to your question. And now I'm so very pleased to welcome Betsy Levy Paluck, Marla Spivak, Elizabeth Turk, and Nancy Macko to the Scripps Presents virtual stage. Welcome all. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you, Karina. And hello, everyone out there. We're so delighted that you're joining us. We have 47 participants. So I would like to begin by framing my first question. The world is experiencing overwhelming change right now. Fires in many parts, floods in others. The environment is suffering. Ecosystems are breaking down. The pandemic has touched all our lives. Physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And all of this is causing us to experience a global imbalance, and yet each of you, Marla, Elizabeth, and Betsy, are working toward rebalancing and repairing. To me, there is a through line in each of your research and practice that shows a deep commitment to community and an effort to create ways for healing in the community you work with, be it animals, people, or nature. All communities are linked, and we know that our energy and intentions can have a positive effect on change. Since this symposium is in conjunction with Elizabeth's Look Up project, perhaps you, Elizabeth, could start by telling us your sense of how you are working with community and your vision for healing.
Thank you. Thank you for Karina for hosting all of this and taking the leap of faith that we could really pull this off in such a short timeline. I think that jumping into unusual events during COVID or during a time period like this provides a focus for engagement that is extraordinary and is so needed. I think because I am an absolute, complete believer in the power of creativity and imagination to present different platforms for engaging with the world. And if we don't jump in and just do, then we will find ourselves following pathways that lead us to the pathway that got us here. And somehow with the chance to look at the pandemic and this way that we are forced to live from a different point of view, a different perspective, it gives optimism. And that in turn brings us to a better and more motivated place. I think for Look Up and for me as a stone sculptor, one of the most influential platforms are Zen gardens. And truly looking at the world from that position of enlightenment has opened up my world in the sense of looking at myself from within a larger community and a larger world. And I think that was why it was so important to me to reach out to others and to paraphrase Betsy, to try and dance on the boundary lines of disciplines, because it's when we merge disciplines that we come up with creative solutions. And so I wanted to offer Scripps doorways for larger meaning, larger potential meanings to our art event, our flash mob art event on Saturday.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful start. Betsy, Marla, would you like to talk about your work with the communities that you love and focus on? Betsy,
go ahead. Sure. I'm happy to start, and thank you so much for having me. I think the opportunity to participate in this really creative project that I believe in very much. I just could see immediately the connections with some of the work that I do, was one of the meaningful ways to be connected to a larger network, a larger organism of humans during COVID. And so I feel so appreciative for that. So thank you. In my work, we take very seriously who we pay attention to in our social worlds, and we mathematically model networks among humans to see who is paying attention to who, and we've done this, for example, in many schools in some of our conflict reduction work. So not looking at social media networks, but rather actual behavioral networks of who young people say they choose to spend time with, for example. And I think that I've learned a couple of things from that I've been thinking about, especially during this time. One is that sometimes people in these networks, they know that they receive a lot of attention from others, and they know the power they have over their social environments and their networks. But others don't. We have been able to, look into our network models and see that some people are incredibly important to the network. They're connected maybe in these more localized regions. They have a lot of influence on the people right around them, and this can have ripple effects, but they don't know that. And so I've been thinking about that a lot during this time, that I think a lot of us have discovered that we can have a large influence on others by reaching out, by building connections and by talking to other people, whether it's about their health, whether it's about their well-being, and so forth. So I think that's one thing I've learned. And then another thing I've learned, and I think this comes out a lot working with young people, but it's really a lesson that we should all take to heart, is that you do need to be creative in starting movements within networks. It needs to capture people's imagination. So it's almost a necessary thing in a high school or a middle school where there's so many things competing for young people's attention. But when we worked with students who were some of the nodes of these networks to get them to band together to try to spread new social norms about tolerance, about trying to stop conflict. We really needed to make it fun as well as mission driven. And so being imaginative in our networks is another thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And so, the bottom line for us is that people are very important within their networks, and they can have these ripple effects. And so we look for chances to make people aware of that, but to also give them the opportunity to come together and have that ripple effect to address others in their networks, to reach out to them.
That is so fascinating, Betsy. Thank you. Marla, I know there's a parallel here.
Yes, there's a parallel and there isn't a parallel. But first, thank you for having me and for bringing me out of my world, which is almost always within a beehive. So I rarely think about human interactions. I of course, am human. I think I'm human. And I do interact with people, but I don't do that kind of reflective thinking or analysis that Betsy might do or Elizabeth might do, and reflection through art. I'm just simply trying to see things through bees' eyes. I'm trying to think like a bee. And so a honeybee colony, the colony is this beautiful animal, this organism full of organisms. Sometimes we call it a superorganism. And yes, they can get sick. And yes, it's a huge network that you can model, Betsy, in that very, very similar. The difference is that bees wouldn't go then and talk to each other about what they feel or think or saw. If they get information, when they're getting lots of information from each other within this colony, they would go out and experience it on their own and then make their own internal judgment. I don't even think that's the right word. Their own internal assessment, whether it's good or not. So, for example, when they forage, and there's been a lot of work done on this by a colleague of mine from Cornell, Tom Seeley, when they go forage for food and how they come back and advertise the food through their waggle dance, or when they're choosing a new nest site, how they come to real estate decisions with thousands of individuals within this nest. My field of study is how they keep themselves healthy. What are their healthcare measures? They can't social distance or mask, but they can do division of labor, and they can, something that I've studied for a long time, is they can sniff out those that are sick and they weed them out of the colony. Sounds inhumane when you view it from a human perspective, but if you consider the colony as the animal, that kind of weeding out of the sick is very similar to our own immune systems that are detecting microbes or foreign invaders, a sickness, and destroying it. So honeybee colonies are beautiful, they're marvelous, and because we can manage them, they're a little bit transparent to us. We can really get into the colony and experience their social behaviors.
One of the reasons why I had invited the two of you in juxtaposing studies and work to this project was I loved Marla's vocabulary on this idea of a superorganism as a doorway for humans to look at themselves as a superorganism. And it seems to be mirrored in so many of Betsy's models of where is my vantage, to whom do I look? And I thought there was sort of a relief in thinking of ourselves as a single organism or a superorganism, and just sort of changing our perspective on the significance of the individual a little bit, and looking at it as, again, from that perspective of enlightenment. How do I influence that group around me? As Marla kept using the word, the locator, or the locating orientation of bees, and then Betsy mirrored that with her social reference vocabulary. And I I love that because I saw that in the organisms that we filmed on as shoreline organism. When we did our tests with smaller groups, people moved much further apart and really moved with their umbrellas. When there was the mass, they became more and more of a single organism, and there were not as many outliers. And that observation kind of brought me to your doorsteps, actually. And I don't know how that will play out in the event on this weekend, but it allowed me to kind of step over the boundary of my discipline and start to look at it, not necessarily as a social scientist or as a naturalist, but to look for solutions in some of our self-defining sort of boundaries and prisons that we put on ourselves. So there's some beautiful conclusions that can be drawn, and maybe it's not too far to kind of assume some of those characteristics for humans.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for blending these responses. That was just a lovely observation in the moment. I wanted to talk about the effect the pandemic has had on the work you're doing and how it's changed, because much of all your work focuses on successful adaptations in the face of diversity or adversity, actually. And we've already gotten a glimpse of that from what you've just shared with us. But did anything change in particular during the pandemic? Were there creative possibilities? I think Elizabeth has already shared some of that with us. One thing I noticed that with social media, there was a rise in awareness of domestic violence and people's behaviors, which pushed certain observable behaviors to the surface. And then more recently, this conflict between masking and vaccinating, and people making choices either for the greater good or for themselves. So I know, Betsy, have there been psychological behaviors that you've identified and then used that knowledge to shape behavioral changes kind of as a result of some of what we're learning? You're muted.
Sorry. I'd love to make some observations about what has happened during COVID. I hope it's somewhat norm setting to admit that I didn't get any creative openings for myself during COVID, being at home with two small children. So I share with everybody the frustration in not finding their creativity during this time. However, I was watching the world, and one of the things that I think I can say from the work that I've been doing in social networks is that the kinds of social networks that we measure and that we model are networks of attention. And you can build lots of different types of networks, right? They can be networks of who's connected to who on Facebook, or they can be networks of who sends who emails. But we're very interested psychologically in attention, who is really looking at whoever else is in their environment. And so there's a really important feature of this network, which means if you're not paying attention to someone, there's no connection between you. And if there are people in your community who are not being paid attention to, they don't show up in the network. In my model, they would disappear. And I think that one of the most important things that has happened during this time, during COVID, is that people have taken initiative to make those people visible, to really build new networks. Even though those people existed, they wouldn't have shown up in a model of attention. And so think about things like mutual aid networks that, really were based in the local. And yet by participating in them, people learned about who is in need in my own community. And although I didn't have the wherewithal to do it, I can tell you with certainty that if I modeled, even in my own community here in Princeton, New Jersey, but this has happened in countless communities, if I had drawn a network of my community before the pandemic and then afterward, right now it would be much denser, much more expansive. People are paying attention to others in their communities now who they weren't before because of these initiatives to help others. And so I think of that as an inspiration that if you think about networks of attention and not just as people, you know that there are ways that people can disappear, but also reappear through our efforts.
Interesting, interesting. I mean, Marla, the colony collapse disorder started almost 20 years ago, and it was a pandemic of its own. And do you see that as a precursor to not the virus, but the way people are behaving or responding, the way the world reacted? Do you see any parallels?
Absolutely. That honeybee colonies are unhealthy in our environment is just symptomatic of an unhealthy environment. If honeybees, one of the most resilient organisms or colonies in the universe, my opinion, if they're having trouble staying well in this environment, what does that say for us? What does it say for every other plant and animal and anything out there? And I think during this pandemic, for me personally, it's given me time and space to think. I don't have young children, Betsy, so it's given me time. It's also, I did have time to go out and continue doing bee research and beekeeping, which is kind of my therapy. But it's been very interesting watching the world think about the group, especially the United States, think about group.
Mm-hmm.
We think about individuals all the time. Honeybees, I don't think they think about much in the reflective kind of thinking, but they're definitely doing things that benefit the group. If they don't do particular things, the group doesn't survive. The colony may die. And so watching humans start to make this connection, oh, it's not just about me as an individual, it's about all of those around me. And I need to be helping all of those around me in whatever class and whatever situation they're in. This is about making sure we get through this. It's just been wonderful to watch. I understand there's many that are would continue to put value over the individual rather than the group. And that's actually part of group behavior. There's always conflict and cooperation. That's part of it. But I really hope that enough people find the beauty and health in group, in this collective, to keep us all healthy. And the changes we make will influence how healthy all the organisms are around us, including bees.
Exactly, exactly. Elizabeth?
I love what both of you just said, and I think that that was part of the motivation of creating Look Up, especially making the bridge to create the first version within Mount San Antonio Gardens, a retirement home that housing the most vulnerable people in the height of the pandemic. We really had to confront issues of trust, responsibility, the view of your neighbor being more important than the view of yourself, and try and create an atmosphere that was not without risk, because the context was grounded in complete risk. And I think that that was one of the most stunning joys of it, that every single participant, I think 650 umbrellas were handed out that day. Everyone had to believe and rely on their neighbor. And I think that that was what was so exciting about trying to bring the concept to a younger generation and really present a platform where you interacted first physically and then second with your intellect and your sort of emotional response. I liked flipping what has been a very conceptual art world sort of on its head, and it seemed appropriate to try and garner trust and some of the trust and joy, I think, first, rather than deeper intellectual concepts.
Certainly, Elizabeth, if you're a person walking around with an umbrella and there's 600 of you in a particular area, from my perspective, when I watched that, I went, wow, they're all bees. Of course I think that. But in fact, they're using local information to either space themselves or move or create group movement, the swarm behavior of birds and fish. You got that in people. It was marvelous. Good job.
Oh, I love that. I loved watching that, especially as you saw the mimicry and this concept of leading from within, as Betsy mentioned, the power that people would have within their local group, and how that would all start to create this interaction. There were some really, really beautiful moments. There's one, as I think everybody will see in the end of the videos, where there's a single umbrella that goes within a circle. And we later found out that was a little 4-year-old girl. And she led that whole group to follow her inside. I thought, oh my gosh, that's exactly what Betsy is talking about. But I also liked on the shoreline one where you see the ocean come in and shape the context, shaping the shape of the group as well. So,
well, I think another thing I'm gleaning from these images I'm gathering is functioning in a less hierarchical fashion. And I mean, the idea of the mutual aid in your community, the idea of paying attention to your neighbor as much as yourself, or if not more, from their point of view. I don't want to use the word democratic because it sounds political, but non-hierarchical, which the bees certainly are. I mean, a lot of people think, oh, there's a queen bee and she runs everything. Well, she's everyone's mother and they adore her. So, it's a symbiotic relationship, but it's non-hierarchical in terms of how they exchange information. And I think seeing what happened in the shoreline video, we see the same thing happen. So another through line in your work is that each of you is interested in identifying patterns as useful indicators. And Marla, you identify the hygienic traits in bees that can help them become stronger and more resilient. And you've said, let the small action be the driver for the large scale change. Are there behavioral patterns among the bees that help you identify these traits, models of resiliency? Can we translate those to people?
Sure. Yes, there are. And of course, as I'm watching a bee colony, there's particular bees that have really acute noses. They don't have noses. They have antennae that act like noses. And they can sniff out if there's something wrong in the nest. And so they'll do one tiny action. They may uncap a cell. And then just the motion of bees, just like these people in umbrellas, and they just get moved away, and another bee might end up over that cell and say, "Ooh, yeah," and then make a little tiny bit, make the hole a little bit bigger, and then get moved in the sea and the wave of all these bees, and another bee may end up over that cell and, "Hey, I don't smell anything. Why is this cell open when it should be closed?" and close it back up. So it's just thousands and thousands and thousands of small actions in the end up weeding out or doing this hygienic behavior to weed out the sick. And it emerges. It's an emergent property. Like you said, the queen is not in charge. She's not a governing body. The workers all the power is vested in all of the workers. It's just exactly how it is. And they just do tiny actions that emerge into this wonderful colony health, or foraging for food, or finding a house, or keeping themselves warm. None of them have the great big plan. They just walk around with their umbrellas and it just happens.
Elizabeth, what kinds of patterns are revealing information to you about self-organizing systems?
I think that's a great question. As a stone carver, I started out looking at patterns for structures that could physically withhold weight. And I think as I've furthered that conversation with myself, I look at patterns that can continually self-edit and still maintain a truth and authenticity. And again, that's why I like this dancing on boundaries. You know, you sort of like, how far can you push one material until it becomes something else? And it's a beautiful metaphor for so much of human activity. And I think that as we look around our world and seeing change so fast, it's an incredible question to ask ourselves: how quickly can we edit and maintain the integrity of our structures? And so that's how I'm looking at patterns. And I think that that's a part of Look Up. As we've grown it, it's really about, you know, one of your words, Nancy, this: how do I locate myself? What is my internal voice, my external voice in this kind of smaller self-location, social reference idea? And then the contextual: how do I see myself from above? Those three kind of GPS points will be shifting continually, but they have to stay authentic. And that's a pattern then. And I'm, you know, so I'm always trying to look at that pattern, that staying authentic in these shifting definitions. So
No,
that's too conceptual.
no, it really grounds your work, and it's very insightful. I think it helps us in the audience see how you see, because you see reductively. I remember reading something that you said, that you like to work with negative space because it allows for the positive to become a shape. And I'm understanding
Absolutely.
that idea now based on what you just told us. I couldn't see it before. I mean, I can see your sculptures, but I couldn't quite grasp the concept. But now it's moving for me, and yet they have GPS points, and it stays authentic and resilient. So, Betsy, you observe social norms and networks that are forces that can drive destructive behavior. Identifying these patterns allows you to create interventions that can reduce these patterns and influence more positive individual and group behavior. Could we see those negative behaviors as types of human disease or toxicity?
Oh, that's really such an interesting question. I think that one way in which that metaphor holds is that these behaviors, many of them actually have a direct impact on our health. So the kind of violence, even verbal violence, abuse that I study is linked to, you know, the kinds of illnesses and stress that are also linked with, you know, viruses and so forth. I think the thing that's really challenging about human behavior in this way, though, is that many negative human behaviors are rewarded, or they're even treated as though you know, that they're a show on stage. We're sort of fascinated, even repulsed, but also fascinated by some types of violence. So it's a very complicated thing, and we've been speaking of hierarchy. Sometimes conflict is a way for people to defend their status or maintain, but even go higher in status if violence is part of a community's norm, if it's considered to be more high status, to be able to wield that abusive power over others. And so I think that's the way in which the metaphor doesn't hold. And so that's why I like to think about social norms, about trying to use networks to address what are the behaviors that we think of as status enhancing. What are the kinds of actions that would give you more status in a community? And humans, it's really just a fact of who we are as social beings, is that we're never going to get away from status or hierarchy, even if some of our reactions to it are to try to flatten, to build mutual aid networks, to try to make the invisible visible in our communities in terms of people. We can have reactions to it. And we also are very sensitive to it in trying to understand norms. And one thing that I was in conversation with Elizabeth about is that it's not that we just look to the powerful in our communities to understand what is normative, what is typical, what is desirable. We also just look, sort of sideways to our peers. But people are actually also very attentive to those who have very little power in their communities. Looking at those people turns out to be very informative for humans, because they assume, and correctly, that people who are at the bottom of a hierarchy are the people who really must pay attention to what is expected of them. Mm-hmm. And so you can learn a lot about the norms of a community by looking at some of its least powerful. So we're incredibly attuned, unlike the bees, to that kind of social hierarchy. And it allows us to pass on powerful messages about what kinds of behaviors are expected and rewarded in a community. And so that's how we've decided in my lab to go after that mechanism, to go after the processes that generate those ideas of what is normal.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the first thing I think of is the Black Lives Matter movement. And that brought awareness from, I'm not saying everyone is at the bottom, but the oppression that people have been feeling for so many years. And it just had to become more evident nationally, globally, to this truth. We have a question from the audience from Daryl Smith. Marla, mm-hmm. Why do bee colonies organize in healthy ways where our social media or localized communities do not seem to yield that?
Well, because when honeybees are paying attention to an advertisement within the nest, and that would be, for example, a bee that just went out and found a flower patch, a scout bee, and she comes back to the nest and she said, "Whoa, that was amazing. I'm going to do this waggle dance and communicate through this waggle the quality, the distance, and the direction of this site." The other bees then will go out and check it out on their own. They don't start talking amongst themselves with judgment, saying, "Are you going to go? I don't like that," or "I didn't like her, what she was wearing," or whatever. They don't start in a conversation about the dancing bee and her message. They just go out and check it out on their own. And if it is a good source, those bees then might come back and dance too. And that signal amplifies. If they go out there and they said, "Whoa, there's nothing out here, it wasn't an honest ad," they come back and they say, "Yeah, whatever, I'm not paying attention to it anymore." So the false news, if you will, dampens. It's just not perpetuated. So the difference is in that little dialogue we have. The thing that is fascinating listening to Betsy, the same dialogue that can enhance a society through these networks is the same one that can also make it sick. And it's the same is true with bees. I mean, they can get in situations where they are just in a downward spiral instead of an upward one.
Thank you. Someone else from the audience wants to know, Marla, if you've read a book by Candace Fleming. It's a children's book called Honeybee.
I think I have. I think I've read them all, and I'm sorry, particularly if Candace Fleming is not the person who asked the question, but if she's listening, if I don't remember that particular one, but I have them all in my office.
Well, we have a few minutes for one last thing I was thinking about, which is kind of related to social media in a way. I was thinking that, Marla does a lot of work with the beekeeping community, which in a way demonstrates Betsy's ideas of the potential for, quote, social psychology principles to address real world problems on a broad scale. And I was thinking about how both Marla and Betsy translate their work into accessible presentations, publications, and workshops, passing information to each other through groups of people, bees, and self-organizing systems. Elizabeth, how do you see your performance work, the lookup work, responding to this as well?
Wow. I think that there's a contagion in realizing one's own imagination. And I think that I felt that with Shoreline and with Look Up. There was something about creating something together that you wanted to share with friends or family, that it enabled an interaction with a neighbor that nothing else had allowed that interaction. And I think that with Shoreline, that was my first attempt at community activities. And I think with this pivot to Look Up because of COVID, we've shifted only slightly, but I think that same contagion and that desire to see the world in a new way, or maybe it's feel the world in a new way and feel your neighbor in a new way. I think that has a power that you want to share. And for me, I think that's one of the reasons why we want to create this gifting opportunity, so that it isn't tied to, to buying and to so it's an equalizer, and that there's a symbol of sharing something, that we still are connected. And so I'm just exploring and figuring out the answer to that question.
Well,
I don't know exactly. Yeah. I hope that I can grow it so big that you start to run into people all over the place with that commonality and a shared memory.
We've reached our time. It's been an absolute treat to talk with each of you and see the relationships between your work and to hear your thinking about it, and to cross-pollinate. I love that idea anyway. We are going to end this for our panel, but we are going to share 2 videos with the audience that ET Projects has created. One about Marla's work in conversation with Elizabeth, and a second one about Betsy's work in conversation with Elizabeth. And our technicians on this, our engineers, are going to set that up for you momentarily. So we're going to say goodbye right now, and we need to have more MacArthur Fellow panels at Scripps College. Thank you, Elizabeth, for organizing this. Thank you, Corinna and engineers, for getting it rolling, and it really went smoothly. We're so good at Zoom now. I'm so proud of us. Betsy and Marla, take really good care. I hope I meet you again.
And just a quick note before we turn over to videos, just to thank everyone here and Nancy for your wonderful moderation. And to remind folks who are current Claremont colleges, students, staff, and faculty, you can still sign up to join us on Saturday. So we will put in the chat the way for you to sign up. And we hope in healthier times that we can welcome all of you back for what is going to be a fantastic community event. And now I'll let my fine colleagues roll the footage.
Look Up, created by the ET Projects Foundation. How do self-organizing systems form? It's easy for us to see ourselves separately and not collectively.
Honeybees are a highly social animal, and they live in a very dense colony. And that colony is actually the animal. And that animal is full of thousands of individual little animals that we recognize as bees. But when all these bees go home and they're in their colony together, they're a superorganism. They can come out of winter with 20,000 bees, and as they grow over the season, they can grow up to 40 or 50,000 bees. Honeybee colonies are all self-organized. There is no central authority. There's nobody in charge. There's no government, and there's no ruling body. So all of the individuals in the nest operate by their internal instincts, but also what they're perceiving in the immediate environment. So they're just getting little bits of local information, and they're responding to them. If there's a threat, first of all, they're going to use a chemical, what we call pheromone, an odor, that signals alarm, alarm. And that just diffuses. So the wave is an odor wave. But yes, they can also touch each other, and they can move very quickly, and through touch they can create a wave of information. There's all kinds of patterns at different scales. So at the bee to bee scale, they can, if they need to form wax, they'll form a chain where they link to each other very delicately, and just then they'll start secreting wax so they can build those wax combs. They produce the wax, so it comes from their bodies, and then they use that bit by bit to cement together, and the hexagonal shape just emerges. It's an emergent property. On a larger scale, the colony assembles itself in a pattern that's loosely organized by age. Honeybees are a model of resiliency. The whole colony is. If there's a problem and they get hit by a pesticide, well, now there's not enough foragers for the colony, but some of the middle-aged bees can age precociously. Their bodies physiologically take on the physiology of a foraging bee, and then other bees kind of fill in the gaps to make sure all the tasks are covered. Social insects have social health care, and that's not a political statement. They just do. They're social animals, and they take care of themselves and everybody in the colony. They bring in antimicrobial substances from the environment that we call propolis and line the whole interior cavity. If a colony of bees has really good nutrition, meaning lots of flowers that produce pollen and nectar, and good healthcare system, it can withstand other diseases and even some pesticide exposure. That's what an emergent property is. So there's a bunch of little individual actions that become a gestalt, something much bigger than the sum of the individual actions. That's the greater action. And that's exactly what a honeybee colony is. As the superorganism, they're much more than the sum of the individual bees.
Even observation is a form of intervention. Any act of looking at and taking measurements of a network, a human network especially, has the potential to change that network. And so that in itself is an intervention. So many things that we do in the world change our social interactions. So the furniture in a room, the architecture of a space, these are all interventions. when we're trying to understand what is considered typical in any social group, instead of looking around and creating this unweighted average of all behavior that we see, we pay attention to certain people. So these are the people who we call the social reference, who have overweighted influence on the norms of a space, on the norms of a group. The information that you are influential over a group of people is very powerful. Many people don't have the intuition that they are influential over a smaller group of people and that this matters. Acting a little bit different isn't something that might just have consequences for you, but it also has a lot of consequences for other people because they're observing what you do and you're, in essence, creating space for them to deviate out a little farther. That influence is really distributed across a large number of people. It's not just concentrated in the hands of the traditionally powerful. We also, as humans, have the instinct to look toward the less powerful when we're trying to understand norms. And the reason why that is because we have this implicit understanding that people who are less powerful have a lot of motivation to follow prevailing norms. But what's very interesting and maybe a paradox about this is that this actually places more power in their hands. Their behavior actually does have quite an impact. We can perceive norms from above, and this is the way most of us think of it. You know, leaders tell us, institutions tell us what the norms are. People also perceive norms sideways. They look to their peers, they look to the people in their social groups, but even more so, they look to the less powerful. So hierarchy matters, but only in the sense that it tells you different places to look for this power over norms. You can find it bubbling up from below. You can find it also moving side to side. We have these models of attention where we know that influence moves through these networks. What matters is where you decide to look. And sometimes it doesn't even matter who's next to you. You're not noticing them, you know, in the same way as someone who you've chosen to look at. And so it really is showing the co-influence of who you see, but also where you direct your attention. You locate yourself in these networks with your attention. If you redirected, you would be in a different place with different connections and different paths of influence. So it's your attention that locates you, not even your physical space. I think that setting our intentions in terms of play could reorient us. Social standing as something that is to be won or lost, and that doesn't leave as much room for playing and testing and redoing and exploring. Maybe one benefit of living in this very unsettled time is the fact that norms have a great deal wider bandwidth, that we're not really sure what the norm is when things are so unsettled. And so there's a little bit more forgiveness. But another way to put that is maybe there's more room for play.